I came back to return a book, but she reminded me I'd forgotten something far more important. I never thought I'd step foot in this library again. Years had passed since I'd last wandered these quiet aisles, my fingers tracing the spines of books that smelled of time and faint lavender polish. Holding the old book I'd somehow forgotten to return, I felt that familiar mix of guilt and nostalgia, the sort of guilt that lingers like a shadow on sunny afternoons. The bell above the entrance chimed softly as I pushed the door open. Dust motes floated lazily in the slanting light, and somewhere between the rows of bookshelves, the air smelled of paper, polished oak, and something unmistakably warm, a quiet, human presence I hadn't expected. "Hello," a voice said. Low, soft, and tinged with amusement. I froze. There she was. Clara. The librarian I remembered from childhood, now in her early 40s, carrying herself with a quiet confidence that seemed to fill the room. Her hair, streaked slightly with silver at the temples, framed her face gracefully. Her eyes, deep and steady, seemed to recognize more than just me, they recognized time itself. "You forgot something," she said, tilting her head with that faintly teasing smile. "Maybe me." The words lingered in the air longer than they should have. I blinked, startled, my heart picking up an errant rhythm. It wasn't just her words, it was the warmth behind them, the way her gaze softened as she waited for me to respond. There was a calmness in her presence that seemed to slow the world around me. I stepped closer, holding the book like a shield, though I knew it was pointless. I didn't mean to," I admitted, a small smile tugging at my lips. The library, once a place of silence, now felt alive. I noticed the subtle curve of her cheekbones, the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders as she leaned slightly on the counter. "Books are easy to forget," she said lightly, running her fingers along the edge of the desk. "People, not so much." Her touch brushed the corner of the book as she handed it back, accidental or deliberate, I couldn't tell. I felt a shiver run down my spine, a quiet electricity that came from the simplest of gestures, a fingertip grazing a cover, a shared laugh at an old memory. For a moment, I was 10 years old again, hiding in the library corners, mesmerized by the world of stories and the woman who seemed to know all of them. And yet, I was no longer a boy. The weight of years, of experiences, of a life lived outside these walls pressed gently on me. She smiled again, just slightly, just enough. That smile held something unspoken, a question, a challenge, a possibility. It invited me in without forcing the door, leaving me to wonder how much of what I felt was memory, and how much was happening right now. I realized then that the library wasn't the only thing I'd forgotten to return. And somehow, as I stood there, the dust motes swirling in the sunlight, the air carrying the scent of old pages and faint lavender, I understood she might be something far more important, something I hadn't known I'd been missing all along. The library felt different now, even though the rows of books and familiar nooks were unchanged. Sunlight filtered through the tall windows, dust motes dancing in lazy spirals, as if the air itself were reminding me of the years I'd let slip by. Clara moved among the shelves with a grace that was subtle but impossible to ignore, the way her fingers lingered on the spines, as if each book held a secret worth savoring, the careful tilt of her head when she read a title. "I think you might like this one," she said softly, holding out a leather-bound novel. Her fingers brushed mine when I reached for it, a fleeting contact that sent an unexpected warmth along my arm. I froze for a fraction of a second, heart caught in the kind of rhythm that only appears when time seems to slow. I remember reading that one as a kid," I murmured, more to myself than to her. She smiled, faint but knowing, and for a moment, our eyes met across the aisle. There was something in her gaze, a quiet recognition, a hint of curiosity, that made it feel like no years had passed at all, and yet the distance of experience and life was palpable. As she guided me down another aisle, we reached for the same book. Our hands brushed again, fingers tangling slightly before she withdrew hers with a playful, almost teasing reluctance. "You've got a habit of reaching for what isn't quite yours," she murmured, voice soft but warm, like sunlight spilling over polished wood. I laughed, nervously, the sound echoing lightly in the quiet space. I guess some habits die hard. She glanced at me, eyes sparkling with something that might have been amusement, or something deeper. Or maybe they just wait for the right person to notice them. Her words lingered in the air like the faint scent of lavender, subtle but undeniable. Walking between the shelves, I noticed everything: the gentle curve of her shoulders beneath the cardigan she wore, the way her hair caught the light as she tucked a strand behind her ear, the soft cadence of her voice as she spoke about a story she loved. Each detail grounded me, pulled me closer, and left me both captivated and hesitant. "I haven't forgotten you," she said suddenly, almost as if reading my thoughts. "Even when you were just a boy wandering these aisles." Her words struck a chord I didn't expect. I'd thought I was returning to a place, a memory, but it turned out I was returning to her, the human heartbeat behind the books, steady and quiet, yet profoundly alive. For a moment, we paused between two shelves, the silence filled with the rustle of pages and the distant hum of sunlight through glass. Our shoulders brushed again, lighter this time, lingering just a heartbeat longer than necessary. I could feel the warmth of her presence in the air, not just beside me, but surrounding me, coaxing a familiarity that felt both comforting and electric. And in that quiet aisle, the space between us became a language of its own: subtle glances, gentle touches, the unspoken understanding that some connections survive time, growing richer and more intricate, waiting patiently for the right moment to be recognized. The library was closing, the quiet hum of fluorescent lights giving way to the softer glow of the evening. Clara lingered by the counter, a slight hesitation in her posture that I almost missed. Then she spoke, her voice gentle, warm, and carrying a hint of vulnerability I hadn't noticed before. "Would you like to grab a coffee?" she asked, almost as if she were testing the air, unsure if it was okay to bridge the gap between old memories and present reality. "There's a little cafe just across the street. It's quiet." I blinked, surprised. My heart thumped in an erratic rhythm, a mix of excitement and nervous hesitation. "I'd love to," I said, keeping my tone steady even though I felt my hands sweat slightly. We stepped outside into the soft chill of early evening. The cafe's windows glowed like amber, inviting us in. As we crossed the street, our shoulders brushed lightly, a fleeting contact that lingered longer in my mind than it did on my skin. The air smelled faintly of rain-damp pavement and the comforting aroma of coffee beans roasting somewhere nearby. Inside, the cafe was cozy: small tables, mismatched chairs, warm light spilling from hanging lamps. She guided us to a corner by the window, and we sat opposite each other. She removed her scarf and draped it over the back of her chair, and I noticed the subtle scent of lavender she always carried, a gentle, calming presence that seemed to wrap around me like a soft blanket. For a while, we talked about books. Simple conversations about favorite stories, authors, and the memories tied to them. But slowly, the dialogue shifted. She began to share things I hadn't expected: moments of quiet loneliness, regrets tucked away like bookmarks in her life, and the subtle ache of feeling invisible in a world that values youth above all else. I listened, leaning slightly forward, meeting her gaze, letting her know with the tilt of my head and the softness in my eyes that I saw her, really saw her. "You're far from invisible," I said gently. "You've always been someone people notice, even if they don't realize it." Her fingers rested lightly on the table, tapping unconsciously as she spoke. I moved my hand closer, close enough that the tips of our fingers brushed. The simple contact sent a warm ripple through me, a quiet electricity that neither of us acknowledged out loud but both felt. The cafe hummed softly around us, the clink of cups, low conversations, the hiss of the espresso machine. Yet inside our little corner, it felt as if the world had quieted, leaving just the two of us and the delicate thread of connection stretching between us. When she laughed at something I said, her eyes crinkled at the corners, and I realized I was memorizing these moments: the curve of her smile, the way her hand lingered on the cup, the gentle sway of her shoulders as she leaned back. Every detail anchored me to her presence, deepening the unspoken pull between us. By the time we left the cafe, night had fallen softly, and the streets glistened with the faint reflection of streetlights. I knew, as I walked beside her, that something significant had shifted. The library had brought me back to books, to memories, but the cafe had brought me closer to her, closer than I'd ever been before, in ways words could barely capture. The rain began almost without warning, soft at first, a gentle patter on the cafe's windows. Outside, the streets blurred into streaks of silver and gold as the night absorbed the downpour. Inside, Clara and I stayed longer than either of us had planned, seated close in the cozy corner, the warm glow of the lamp casting a halo around her. She grew quiet, watching the rain trace winding paths down the glass. I noticed the subtle tension in her shoulders, a fragile hesitation that mirrored something deeper within her. After a long pause, she admitted softly, almost in a whisper, I hesitate to let anyone close. Sometimes, it's easier to remain invisible. Her word struck me, carrying a vulnerability I hadn't expected. She had always been composed, confident, the kind of presence that seemed untouchable. And yet here she was, laying bare a truth she'd likely kept hidden for years. I reached across the table, letting my hand hover near hers without pressing, a silent reassurance. You don't have to hide, I murmured. Not from me. I've always noticed you, more than you might think. She looked up, her eyes glimmering with a mixture of surprise and something more tender. For a moment, the hum of the cafe faded into the background, all I could hear was the rhythm of the rain and the quiet cadence of her breath. The air between us thickened, charged with something unspoken, a tension neither of us had named but both felt. A single droplet ran down the glass, catching the light like a tiny prism, and I found myself studying her hand, fingers brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. The movement was simple, almost casual, yet it carried weight, a gentle closeness that made my chest tighten. She shivered slightly, and instinctively, I leaned in a fraction, letting the warmth of my presence brush against hers. It's strange, she whispered, how someone can feel familiar, yet still surprise you. I smiled, my gaze lingering on her with unspoken affection. Maybe some connections are meant to wait, I said, letting the words hang between us like the rain outside, persistent, inevitable, quietly insistent. The cafe grew quieter as the evening deepened, yet neither of us moved to leave. She reached out tentatively, her fingers brushing the back of my hand. The contact was fleeting, delicate, but it carried the full weight of trust and curiosity. My pulse quickened, not from urgency, but from the subtle acknowledgement that something was shifting, slowly, beautifully, undeniably. We sat there, watching the rain together, the world outside reduced to droplets and reflections. Each pause, each glance, each small movement felt charged with meaning. She tilted her head, resting it near mine for a heartbeat, just enough for our shoulders to touch. It wasn't a grand gesture, but the warmth of her closeness was unmistakable, a quiet promise wrapped in the gentle intimacy of the moment. As the rain continued its soft symphony, I realized that this night was more than chance, more than an ordinary encounter. It was a turning point, a subtle, tender revelation that the distance between us, the years, and the hesitation could all dissolve with time, patience, and a single shared presence beneath the patter of rain on the glass. By the time we left the cafe, the rain had grown steadier, drumming gently against the pavement, turning the streets into mirrors reflecting the city's warm lights. Clara hesitated at the door, glancing over her shoulder as if unsure whether to step back into the chill. I offered her my umbrella, holding it wide to cover us both. "Thank you," she murmured, stepping close enough that our shoulders brushed beneath the fabric. The contact was subtle, but it sent a quiet, steady warmth through me, a reminder of just how tangible her presence had become in these past hours. We walked side by side, the small umbrella creating a private canopy in the middle of the wet, glistening street. The soft splash of our footsteps in the puddles echoed against the walls of nearby buildings, a gentle rhythm to accompany the silence that had settled comfortably between us. Every so often, our hands would graze as we adjusted the umbrella, and each brush lingered a moment too long to feel accidental. "I haven't walked in the rain like this in years," she said quietly, looking down at the reflections of streetlights on wet asphalt. Her voice carried a softness that made me want to listen more closely, to memorize every nuance. I smiled. Sometimes, the rain makes ordinary moments feel alive. My words hung between us, not grand or poetic, but carrying the simple truth that had been threading itself through the evening, that being near her made everything feel amplified, more real, more urgent in a way that words could barely capture. A sudden gust of wind sent a few droplets racing toward us, and we laughed together, instinctively stepping closer under the umbrella. Her head brushed against my shoulder, light and fleeting, yet my chest tightened at the intimacy of the contact. I felt the warmth of her presence, the subtle steady pressure of her hand occasionally touching my arm, as if seeking reassurance that this small closeness was safe, welcome. "Do you always make rainy nights feel different?" she teased, a hint of mischief in her tone, though her eyes betrayed a deeper curiosity. I shrugged, though my heart was pounding. Maybe it's not me. Maybe it's just the company. My glance met hers under the umbrella, and I thought I caught a flicker of recognition, the understanding that this night was shifting into something neither of us could ignore. We continued down the narrow streets, lights shimmering on the wet pavement like scattered gold. Every so often, we'd fall into step, shoulders brushing, elbows lightly touching. It was gentle, tentative, and yet electric in its own way, a dialogue spoken entirely through closeness, breath, and lingering glances. When we finally reached her door, the world beyond the umbrella seemed to fade into quiet shadows. She paused, looking up at me with that soft, open vulnerability I had come to cherish. Neither of us spoke for a long moment. The rain continued to fall, steady and rhythmic, as if marking time for the delicate, unspoken promises forming between us. I realized then that this walk, this small act of shared space and warmth, had changed everything. The distance between us, both in years and in unspoken hesitation, had narrowed. The brush of a hand, the press of shoulders, the quiet laughter under the rain, each moment was a step toward something far more profound than either of us had expected. Clara's door loomed ahead, warm light spilling through the edges, a soft contrast to the damp chill of the evening. She hesitated for just a moment before opening it, and I stepped inside, shaking off the rain from my coat. The scent of her home enveloped me instantly, a mix of polished wood, aged books, and the subtle sweetness of vanilla candles flickering softly on the mantel. It was comforting, intimate, the kind of place that made you feel safe before you even knew why. She gestured for me to sit on the couch, draping a towel over the armrest. The fabric smelled faintly of lavender, and as I dried my coat, I caught sight of her sitting opposite me, the soft curve of her shoulders relaxed yet poised, the quiet tension of someone revealing themselves slowly. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The rain outside created a gentle percussion on the windows, a soundtrack for the fragile quiet that wrapped around us. Then, softly, she spoke, her voice low, almost vulnerable. "I haven't felt truly seen in a long time." "Not really. People notice what I do, maybe, but they rarely notice who I am." Her words struck me with a force I hadn't anticipated. I had sensed her confidence, her grace, but I hadn't realized the depth of solitude that accompanied it. She looked at me then, her eyes holding a flicker of hesitation, searching for some assurance. "You are seen," I said, my voice steady but tender. "Not just noticed. Seen." I moved slightly closer, letting the warmth of my presence bridge the small space between us. She didn't pull back. She looked down, twisting a hand in her lap, then back up at me, vulnerability and courage mingling in her gaze. "It's strange," she admitted, "how someone can step back into your life and make you feel remembered, maybe even missed." I swallowed, feeling the weight of honesty settle in my chest. "I didn't just come back for the book," I confessed. "I came back for this. For you. For the feeling I never really understood as a kid, but that's been waiting quietly in the background all these years." Her lips curved into a small, tentative smile, the kind that held both relief and disbelief. She leaned slightly closer, our knees brushing, a deliberate closeness that carried more than words could convey. Her gaze held mine, searching, testing, daring me to meet her truth with my own. Tentatively, I reached out, tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear. My fingers lingered, tracing the soft curve of her cheek. The contact was light, but electric, a gentle affirmation, a bridge of trust. She didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head, letting my hand rest there, and for a moment, the world outside disappeared. We sat there in silence, the steady rhythm of rain against the window filling the pauses between our breaths. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't urgent, but it was profound, the slow, undeniable acknowledgement of two people recognizing a connection that had always been there, waiting to be nurtured. And in that quiet living room, between the scent of books and the soft glow of candlelight, the walls we had both carried for years began to fall away. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was seen, fully, and I was determined to make sure she never felt forgotten again. The rain had softened to a gentle drizzle by the time the evening drew to a close. Clara and I lingered in her living room, the soft glow of candlelight wrapping the room in warmth. Outside, the world seemed quiet, hushed as if giving us this moment alone. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken words, a tension that had been building for hours now resolving itself in the smallest, most delicate gestures. She sank into the couch beside me, close but not fully touching at first. Her hand rested lightly on her lap, fingers brushing the edge of mine, and I felt a subtle shiver of anticipation ripple through me. Slowly, cautiously, she leaned in, letting her head rest against my chest. The warmth of her body pressed gently into mine, grounding me, and for the first time that night, I felt a stillness inside, a quiet certainty that we were exactly where we were meant to be. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders, holding her as if I could shield her from every hurt she had ever endured, every lonely night she had borne with quiet dignity. The steady rhythm of her heartbeat against my chest became a lullaby, and I felt a deep, unshakable connection, one that had grown slowly, patiently, through every brush of hands, every shared glance, every laugh and pause along the way. "It feels strange," she whispered, her voice barely above the soft patter of rain on the window. "How someone can feel like home, even after all this time." I pressed my forehead gently to the top of her head, inhaling the familiar scent of lavender and vanilla that seemed uniquely hers. "Maybe that's because you were never really forgotten," I said. "Maybe you were just waiting to be found." Her lips curved into a small, contented smile, and she shifted slightly, curling closer against me. The weight of her presence was comforting, grounding, yet it carried a thrill, the thrill of new beginnings wrapped in the tenderness of patience and care. It wasn't a sudden, explosive declaration of love, it was something more profound, quiet understanding, mutual respect, and the deep, unspoken knowledge that we belonged in this space together. We stayed that way for a long while, letting the silence fill the room. Every so often, our fingers brushed, our knees pressed lightly together, our shoulders shifted in rhythm as though the space between us had become a language of its own. There was no rush, no urgency, only the shared awareness of closeness, of safety, and of something beautiful that had been waiting patiently for this moment. Finally, I bent slightly, pressing a soft kiss to her forehead. It was gentle, reverent, an acknowledgement of the trust she had shown me, and a promise that I would meet her with patience and care, always. She tilted her head into the kiss, eyes closing, and I felt a quiet, profound joy settle over us. The rain outside eased into a light drizzle, the world returning to itself, but inside, time seemed to stand still. In that room, with her heartbeat against mine, I realized that the library, the cafe, the rain, all of it, had been leading to this. Not a fleeting moment of passion, but a lasting, tender connection, grounded in care, respect, and affection. And as we sat there, wrapped in warmth and quiet understanding, I knew, we had found something rare, something enduring. She had not been forgotten. She had simply been waiting for the right person, and finally, we were both exactly where we were meant to be. If this story warmed your heart, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the bell, so you never miss a moment of slow burn romance and heartfelt connections. Share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear which moment made your heart